So Thomas Emerson, my good mate down in Canberra, the founder of Praxis. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's awesome to be in conversation once again, man.
Thanks for having me on. I always enjoy our conversations, and I guess we're hoping that other people will too.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a recorded yarn of anyone that we could have had. So we've done a round one where you gave us a good kind of detail into your history and how you got into this landscape. But if people haven't listened to that, give us a brief kind of explanation of how you came to be where you are now and what you're doing at the moment.
Yeah, and I should have asked you about this before. Are you hoping that this will be a general conversation, or one that's mostly for people who are interested in movement?
Both. I think that you are able to be understood by the general person because you speak in relatable kind of concepts. So I think that, we should dive in where we want to dive in, but at the same time, if we think that we need to provide some context for the layperson, then we can. But let's just go with it.
All right. Well, what can I say? My history. Growing up, I played a lot of sport, mostly rugby and cricket. And as I got older through school, I started also taking my studies seriously and getting interested in ideas, which perhaps was thanks to some really fantastic teachers that I had. A couple of teachers who took an interest in me, and that was really great. Probably that combined with my temperament as well, my general disposition. And then when I finished high school, I went and studied philosophy for 4 years. I did my undergrad degree in that. And during that time, I started getting interested in movement practice as well. So like I said, I played a lot of sport, and I was training growing up, doing the kind of standard gym stuff to supplement my sport and, to build the kind of physique that I wanted, everything that particularly young guys get interested in when they turn, 13, 14. So I was doing that. But ended up with a couple of injuries that were problematic and not going away. Had chronic hip and back pain for 7 years in the end, and a shoulder problem as well. The shoulder would just constantly dislocate, doing basically nothing and anything. And that's what got me looking into other perspectives on training, because I was realizing that, my training was building a certain kind of physique that looked a certain way, and perhaps I could express power in certain ways, but I was injured and my training wasn't helping with that. So thanks to my brother, Ben, actually, I came across some amazing teachers who were teaching from a movement perspective. Ida Portal, who everyone knows in this kind of community, in this domain, and Simon Thakur, who should be more well-known than he is, although I think his reputation is growing, and he's based in Australia. And they shared some perspectives and tools that really worked, helped me with my pain, helped me rehabilitate my injuries in ways that didn't seem to be possible, wasn't possible through conventional therapeutic approaches. And I got out of pain and then started pursuing movement for its own sake. And this was alongside the philosophy, alongside my studies. And it felt like a really good engaging kind of combination to be basically what my days would look like toward the end of my degree, as I would get up and do a few hours of training in the morning, study for a few hours, do some reading, do some writing perhaps, and then do a couple more hours of training in the afternoon and hang out with people I cared about in the evening. And that was kind of my day. And that felt engaging, that felt exciting to me, and a good way to develop myself. Those two things started combining, merging to some extent, and complementing each other. And I'm sure we'll talk about that. So I was doing that for a good time. I've now been practicing from a movement perspective for 5 years, and teaching for the last 3 years out of the studio that I founded in Canberra called Praxis, which is, it's almost our 3-year anniversary. It will be in a few days or in a week or so, which is great.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And I've been teaching there and sharing some of the concepts that have been shared with me, sharing some of the things I've learned, and building a bit of a community here in Canberra of other people who are interested in learning those things and in approaching their lives from a slightly different perspective than what might be seen as normal in our culture. So that's a rapid fire biography. Hope that suffices.
That's perfect, man. Awesome. I'd love to get into Simon's work, and maybe that's a good place to start because we didn't get into it last time. But give us some details about Simon and what you've learned from him.
Another big question.
Yeah.
Well, to begin with, I wouldn't want to misrepresent Simon. So obviously anything, or any of my teachers or anyone I've learned from. So anything I have to say is going to be filtered through my specific lens and my experience of that person and what they've got to share. With that disclaimer, what I would say about Simon is that he really understands and has a kind of magical way of sharing that understanding, how the mind and body interact and how they're not. I mean, we have to use concepts, right? So we'll say the mind and we'll say the body, but of course those things we can't really distinguish them that way, although we try to. They're deeply connected. And the stories that you're telling about your experience affect your physical experience and vice versa, right? So conceptually speaking, I mean, experientially speaking, we kind of touched on this before the conversation started. I mean, I would just say go and learn from him, do some work with Simon, go to an event, go to a workshop, go to a retreat, go to a class of his and see what it's like. But a big part of what it looks like practically is, my experience at least, is learning to feel and move every part of the body with the greatest degree of clarity possible. So we have this universe of a body here that can be felt, that can be moved, that can be experienced with lesser or greater degrees of clarity, in the same way that I like to use the analogy of a map. And we do have maps of our bodies in our brains that are affected by our practices. Yeah. So we could have a map, and I'm in Canberra here and you're not. So for you to get to Canberra, then the most useful map will be the one that lays out the path between where you are and Canberra, right? Between Brisbane and Canberra. And that's going to be zoomed out to a certain perspective, right? You imagine you're on Google Maps and you search Canberra. It's quite a zoomed out perspective. There's not much detail on that map. And that's the map that most of us have of our bodies. Like, okay, I have a body that can walk and have a body that perhaps can jump and maybe run and do a few basic things. But if we zoom in, as you arrive in Canberra, then you're going to need a different map to get to my specific location. And I'm in a specific suburb in Canberra. So then you zoom in on that map, right? And that might lay out the path from where you are to the suburb that I'm in. And then when you get to this suburb, then you need a map, a more refined, higher detailed map, higher definition map of the streets in the area, right? To get to my street. And then you get to my street, and then you need to know what number on the street, where is this place located? Where's the door? And then you zoom in and zoom in and zoom in. Okay, now I'm inside the door. Which room is he in? I'm trying to find this guy. And then you get in, and then there's an infinite detail, right? Infinite potential detail, because you could zoom in and come all the way in and zoom in on anything. Like, okay, the head of this microphone is just infinitely complex. Mm. Zoom all the way into that, or all the way out where the microphone isn't even showed, right? Zoom out and it's just the pale blue dot. So the body is very much like that. The body can be experienced as the map of Australia, very vague and general, very zoomed out. And sometimes we want it to feel that way. Like in this conversation, we're sitting here. I don't really need a high definition map of my body in this moment. But at other times, I'd love to have a high definition map where I can feel every single part. And something that Simon said once that really resonated with me, and I think of often, is you want to feel like you can dance with every single part of your body. Take any part of the body, and I really like the example of a cat. A cat, you touch a cat anywhere on its body and it has that reaction at that exact point. It's got this incredible body mapping. I don't understand how it functions. Someone who's listening probably does. But we can cultivate that. We can develop that. And Simon's tools are really amazing for that. That's what it's about, is building awareness, building higher definition maps of the body through practice. And that's what I've learned from him. There's plenty more I could say. Do you have any questions or a direction you'd like to take that conversation?
I think I was exposed to, when I was one of your students, some of the work that had come through Simon in terms of the elasticity and the kind of joint articulations. And I've heard Simon speak on other podcasts about, looking at the body and its functionality as a kind of history, as a kind of book that you can read of the evolutionary history of the animals that you've come from. And you can experience that like tangibly. And then when you look at animals, you can then, feel what that feels like.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, Simon's the man to listen to on that topic, but that is a big thing that I've learned from him. This idea of stories that I mentioned in the very beginning, that your body is imbued with stories, right? And your body is like a stored history of what you've done and what's happened to you in your life. And we know this because of trauma, right? Like maybe you have a catastrophic knee injury playing sport. Your body will remember the location of that injury and the movement that you were doing when that injury happened, and perhaps what happened around that injury. Like we're not the best at knowing, is this memory connected to what actually happened or not? Like we just kind of clump them together and go, stay away from that area where that really traumatic thing happened, right? Trauma is stored in the body. We know that. But other things are too. Like maybe there's a dish that your mother made when you were growing up, and it's your favorite dish, and you smell something associated with that dish or her perfume or something. And immediately this like cascade of memories starts unfolding. Before you think about it, you smell the thing and the cascade happens. And then you start observing, you're going, why is this cascade? Oh yeah, it's because mom used to make that dish or whatever. Like my ex-girlfriend had that perfume or whatever. So these triggers are there, and mostly they're just developing on their own. There's no agency behind that process for many of us, many of our experiences. It's just something happened and now that's stored in my body. Some trauma got stored in my body, or some positive thing got stored in my body. It's this like classical conditioning thing, right? That's what we use to train our dogs, train our pets, and that's happening to us. And part of Simon's perspective and what I've really taken on is that you can embed your own stories in the body. You can pick what the story is going to be. It's completely up to you. And through your practice, you can't just decide, right? You can't just think, oh, I want to experience my body as being imbued with this particular story. You have to actually practice that. And then the things do become connected, because we know neurologically, the saying with neuroplasticity, neurons that fire together wire together. So if every time you step through the door, I smack you over the head, you're going to be afraid of that door, right? But it's got nothing to do with the door, but I created an association. And we do the same thing for ourselves. So if I'm doing my physical practice, I'm doing my training, and in my mind, I'm going, I'm weak, I'm injured. I'm not physically I don't present myself physically. I don't have the appearance that I'd like to have. And that's my narrative while I'm training. That story is getting embedded in the body. And what I think is important is acknowledging that and then taking some agency and going, well, I'm going to decide the story for myself. And you can do that with the evolutionary perspective, practicing the animal movement patterns and feeling what it feels like to be those animals, and feeling your evolutionary history in your body during the practice. Or another example, something that kind of arose on its own with me recently was I was just sitting down, paying attention to my heartbeat, right? One of these awareness practices, just feeling my pulse. And then I thought, don't you think it's amazing that this apparatus has not failed me once? My entire life, it's not failed, and we've got amazing technology, but my iPhone sometimes just turns off, it just fails for a moment. And then I have to turn it back on. It's like, well, this is pretty amazing, but even those technologies that we've developed fail from time to time. But my heart's never failed. And I was just thinking, okay, I'm feeling my heartbeat and thinking that. And then I thought, well, it's not just that my heart's never failed, because my parents' hearts had to never fail for me to be born, right? And their parents' hearts had to never fail for them to be born. So where does your heartbeat come from? Well, it comes from your mother, right? And then their parents and all of our ancestors' heartbeats had to never fail for us to be here having this feeling of a heart beating in the chest, right? But then you go back and you go, well, it's not just the human ancestors. Like the first human heartbeat had to come from something else. And the first heartbeat of that mammal, that primate, perhaps had to come from some other mammal. And that had to come from a reptile. And then I looked up, well, when was the first heartbeat?
Yeah.
And it was 500 million years ago.
Wow.
So you think about that, right? Like there's a 500 million year long succession of heartbeats not failing that had to happen for you to be here feeling your heartbeat now, right? And you could you can have that thought and it makes your hair stand on end, right? It's
Fucking
like, whoa,
oath. I know.
holy shit. Like, how did that happen? How
That's
did it not fail
wild.
this whole time?
Yeah.
And you can have that thought every time you feel your heartbeat, if you want, right? Because you embed that story. And so I started practicing that. I go, well, every time I notice my heartbeat, I'll imagine that succession of unbroken heartbeats, successful reproduction, millions of years with no failures. Like, how unlikely is that? But our culture says, well, what's your heart? It's like a pump. That's the story that most of us have. Heartbeat, that's like a pump, and we don't feel it. We just go, yeah, the heart pumps blood. Cool. Next thing. So it's like a bit primitive, that story, and it's a bit empty. And we can talk about this if you want to, the mechanization of the body, and I'm sure we'll go on to that topic, how that's the predominant narrative in our culture, and that has an effect. It really has an effect. So that's what I would say. That's an important, I think it's perhaps the fundamental concept to consider. What are the stories that I'm telling while I move? How am I conceptualizing my body? Because that's going to change how I experience it. Yeah. And it's not just in the moment of conceptualization, it's in the practice itself. So I can cognitively have that story play out and I can decide to share it with you, or I can feel it every time I notice my heart beating in my chest. And for that second option to happen, I need to meditate on it and contemplate and feel it and think about the story. Feel my heartbeat, consider the story. Feel my heartbeat, imagine that succession. And then they become intertwined. And you have a higher definition of the body map. That's kind of, what would you say? There are these ornaments on it as well. Oh yeah, that injury happened here. What's that about? That part of you. Oh yeah, that shoulder, that's kind of like a primate's shoulder that was used for swinging. Yeah, and so on and so on.
Wow. We talk about the mechanization of the body, and I'm interested to dig into that. Where did that start, or what kind of ideas underlie that? Because it was probably a gradual process.
I'm no historian, so I don't know, but I imagine it's part of our cultural development, part of our, what would you say, our worship of technology, right, of the machine. So I'm sure the narrative, emerged to a greater degree during the Industrial Revolution, when everything was being mechanized, and we looked around us and we said, oh, our bodies are kind of like machines as well. They're kind of like the things that we're building. And it's this tricky thing that can happen with us, and has happened with us over and over and over again, where we construct something, we create something new, and then we use that new thing to redefine ourselves. We define ourselves according to the technology, right? And this is happening with social media and all these things that are affecting us now. And we can get into that as well, perhaps, this special ability we have to transform the world, and then the world transforms us back, right? But in terms of the mechanization of the body, this is the language that we use. Those are the terms that we use when we describe our bodies. The body's like a machine. It's like, what kind of machine is it like? Well, it's like a vehicle, right? And what's it a vehicle for? So it's a vehicle for my brain. And when we say brain, we really mean mind. We like to think that we're being biological and scientific by saying brain. But, my brain's exploding. It's like, well, it's not. Your mind is, right? So we've kind of carried that idea of a separate mind through, because that's how we experience ourselves a lot of the time, by replacing the term with the word brain. But there are consequences to that mechanization, because you do tell that story to yourself. Okay, the heart pumps blood, and food is fuel for the machine, and the machine that is the body is this vehicle. That's how you start treating it, right? And that's how you start experiencing it. And I think the issue with that is that our machines are tools. And so we start viewing our bodies as tools only, right? What can my body do for me? Or what is it doing that's bothering me? And that immediately creates distance between me and my body. There's me, whatever I am. And then there's this thing that I call my body, which is separate. And that either is injured, is in pain, doesn't look the way I'd like it to look, or is athletic, is powerful, but it's separate. So when I have a hand injury, it's not that I'm injured, it's that my hand is injured. Yeah. And that's annoying me, but it's not me. And this objectification of the body, where we're experiencing it and conceptualizing it and talking about it, because language does matter, only as a thing that's an object that's not experienced subjectively, that becomes how we experience the body. We view it as a separate thing that we're not, I talk about being in your body. Well, what about being as your body? Right. But we talk about being in it like it's this separate entity. And I think that does have consequences. It does have consequences. We can go into them. That's what's expressed in the AI movement. That's what we're hoping for with artificial intelligence, is that we can, and this maybe it's a bit too philosophical, but I think it's interesting, is all religions, everything that we've developed as a species philosophically has been an attempt to reconcile the fact that we're no longer one with ourselves, right? So you look at your dog lying on the couch and it's just being a dog. It's just one with itself. Yeah. It doesn't have a conception of itself as this thing that persists through time, as this organism that persists through time, this identity. It's just one with itself. The subjective experience of being that creature and the object that is the creature, the two are completely merged. And in the human case, they became separated, so that I can conceptualize the fact that I will exist tomorrow and I'll exist the day after that. So now my life and myself is an object for me that I can think about. And that creates suffering. That creates anxiety. Because then I know all the bad things are going to happen to me, right? And the thing is, most of the bad things that are going to happen to you as a consequence of the fact that you're in a body. Because we know that the body is limited. But there's something about consciousness, there's something about the mind that feels unlimited, feels completely expansive and open. And this is what I'm saying with the AI movement, the culmination of the technical development, this path, this trajectory that we're on is, well, let me get rid of my body and just upload my consciousness into the cloud, because then I don't have to feel pain. I don't have to die, most importantly. I don't have to suffer. I won't be limited. And I'll just be this completely infinite being. I'll be God. That's the idea. That's what we're moving towards. And we resolve the problem of this mind-body distinction that's created by the fact that we know we'll exist tomorrow, this object-subject distinction. We resolve it by just eliminating the object. I'll just be the subject. But I don't know that that's possible. I don't think it's possible, and I don't think it's the right path. We want a union of the two, right? And that's how you describe your experience when you're in a flow state. It's that narrative that's separate, disappears, and you're just in it again. And that's why it feels good. And they're the moments that you love and that you're engaged with. So yeah, that's the path that I think we're on with this mechanization of the body. This conceptualization of the body is something that's basically a hindrance. And it's treated that way in so many different domains. And I don't think it's the right path, because, there is this idea that our minds are most us. And this started with Aristotle, with the ancient Greeks. Human being, the rational animal, right? What distinguishes us from all the other creatures? Our capacity for reason, to be rational, right? To think abstract thoughts. And you think about the etymology of rationality, to ration, right? To ration food, because I know tomorrow exists. It's just what we're talking about. I know that the next day exists, so I have to ration. That might be the most distinctive feature. That might be what differentiates us from other things. But does that make it the most essential feature that we have? And this was his argument. It's like, well, how do you differentiate a hammer from a nail? Where a hammer is for hammering. What's it good for? Hammering. That's what makes it different. And a chair, what's that good for? That's good for sitting on. That's what makes it different. Well, what's a human good for? Reasoning. Okay, that's what makes humans different. But perhaps our most essential attributes are actually our oldest attributes. Right? And they're the things that we share with all the other creatures. This central tube, or the inner tube that Simon talks a lot about, of the mouth, the inner tube down to the anus, that processes energy, that metabolizes. Maybe that's the most essential part of us. And then this extra layer that got scaffolded on top of that, that's this animal that can locomote and move around. And actually Aristotle was making these distinctions himself as well, that can move that inner tube from place to place to get food and to reproduce, avoid predators, pursue prey, and so on. And then the last edition of this rational, this seemingly special kind of consciousness, this rational being, sits on top of all of that more essential scaffolding. Yeah, that more essential structure. So yeah, I do think there's a big shift that needs to happen, and that it would be a good thing for us to make that shift as we continue progressing as a species.
There seems like a modern day, worship, since God is dead and we're in such secular societies, there's so many upspringings of, different kind of new age spirituality. But there, as we're saying, I always wondered why why people will always tell you, have you heard Elon Musk talk about uploading consciousness? It's crazy. The amount of times I've heard that sentence from people who aren't usually interested in that at all is like many, and what makes that meme, what makes that particular idea so volatile? Why do people love reproducing that so much? You know what I mean? And worshiping that particular idea? Because to me, I think, all right, brain in a vat, if you would actually upload consciousness, if your consciousness arises as maybe an emergence from the biological workings in your brain, which are incredibly complex, then how do we suppose that you might still have consciousness if you were to separate it from the body and all of the afferent, the input information into the brain, and that information is coming from the outside world as well? Like, there's an incredibly complex interaction from outside to in, that if we're supposed to artificially give that to the brain in input, that's complexity beyond fathomability, let alone trying to work out how to give that to the brain, which is the most complex motherfucker in the whole universe. You know what I mean? It's wild, dude.
Yeah. It's a crazy mission to be on. But what is Elon Musk doing? And he's at the front of it, the forefront of it, which is why everyone knows his name. He's uploading our consciousness into the cloud so that we don't have to die. And he's getting us off this planet so that we don't have to die on this planet. It's all like we've put all eggs in the technology basket. And what's the biggest problem we have that needs solving? The fact that we'll die. The fact that this ego, this Tom, this collection of atoms and beliefs and experiences that seems to persist over time, and my knowledge of that, which makes me different, apparently makes us different from the other animals. It's a gradient, right? Everyone's somewhere on that evolutionary scale. It's not just yes or no in terms of self-consciousness. Well, we need to solve that problem. That's the way it seems. That's the way it seems to us. And that's how you solve it technologically, is you replace the body with a machine that can't break down. That's where we're trying to go. But the other perspective is, well, consciousness does persist. It might not persist as me. It might not persist as Tom, but it persists, and the heartbeat persists. It's made it 500 million years. So these things do persist. There is this continuity, this survival beyond death, but it's not of this construct, this story that you have of yourself. It's something else. And I do think there is meaning there, because that reality can lead to nihilism, right? None of this matters because I'm going to die unless Elon Musk solves my problems. But I don't think that's true either. I think that's a mistake. I don't believe that. And I think you can actually choose not to believe that. And that's what I choose. I choose to believe that it does matter, that I'm part of some evolution in consciousness, some evolutionary tale, right, that can be embedded in the story through those practices that we discussed, and that there's meaning in that matters, because we're so limited. How would we know? What arrogance to say, oh, none of this matters. The arrogance of the intellect, man. It's a real trap. So we don't know, but all we can do is go off our instincts, and everything except for our brains, except for the story, the scientific story that eliminates the subjective experience and reduces everything to this objective up to objectivity, that might tell us that it's all meaningless. We're this little speck sitting in infinity, and that I'm this little speck of time sitting in an infinite scale of time. But everything else doesn't point to that. Everything else is a subject, in your subjective experience, doesn't point in that direction. And it starts with the body. It starts with, well, I do a certain action today and that feels meaningful and valuable and I'm engaged in it. We're engaged in this conversation and there's a connection and that feels like it matters. It feels like it matters. But we override that feeling, that intuition that what we're doing does matter, that there's meaning here, with this other story that says, no, it's not the scientific story. Nothing you do matters because it all dies with you, with the death of your body. I'm not convinced of that.
Yeah, man, that's I agree. And I think that there's definitely, I don't know if this is completely right, but I see some kind of contemplative kind of traditions that seem to, and I think we might have talked about this before, seem to be almost disembodying. And like, if you look at what you would consider a monk, it's like a person they're kind of just an abstract form when you look at them. They've got like no hair because that's too much of an effort to worry about. Or I don't know why I don't have any hair, to be honest. It could be imbued with meaning, but to me, it seems like they all kind of like live in one place. Everything's very consistent and it's very kind of like low frequency, kind of like way of living, and everything's like kind of more controlled. But those are all kind of abstract. Like those come from the abstract into the world, not from the world into our thought processes. And it seems like those kind of, maybe traditions are more kind of disembodying and not accepting of the reality of death and the ups and downs and the Europeanness of life. You know what I mean? There's so much more emotional kind of thing that we go pay $10,000 to fly overseas and be a part of the culture,
Right. Well, it's a denial of the body in the material world. That's a part of some of those traditions.
Yeah.
And neither of us are experts, so we probably shouldn't talk too much about them and the reasoning behind their shaved heads. But
exactly.
But that does seem to be underpinning. It's like, if I can neutralize my experience, so there's no suffering. That's the idea, right? There's no good or bad. There's only your interpretation of things as good or bad. And there's truth to that. There is. And it's a very important thing to know and to practice. But also perhaps, and this is something that Nietzsche noticed or observed, maybe you can't get the highs without the lows. Maybe if you separate yourself from the stream of experience continuously, you're also missing something by not being a part of that. And some of those traditions, they do advocate that, like this complete equanimity to what happens, which can be fantastic if everything that's happening is terrible. But what about being fully engaged? What about being fully in something? You lose that ability if you detach too much. So yeah, it's this somewhat, it's oscillating between the two positions. There's this great quote, I've forgotten it, man, but you want to be able to be the spectator and the player in the game. You want to oscillate between those two positions, so that you are having that full experience of, my life is this object that I can oversee and shift and play with and manipulate like any other object. But it's also something I want to live. You want to live your life, right? Not just oversee it. And it's not easy to find the balance between those two things and to manage those two things. But in my mind, that's a objective.
Mm-hmm. Completely, man. Still on the topic of like mind body duality and things like that, one thing, what do you think about this? It always gets me when I hear it, and it always confuses me why they have to say it, but they always say this they'll be like, we put 10 participants through an intervention where they meditated for 10 minutes a day, and they reported, significant improvements in wellness and well-being. And that was correlated with changes in the brain. And people will say, an actual structural difference has happened. And I don't know if that sounds weird to you, but I'm always like, how else would they have those experiences if the actual structure of the brain did not facilitate those experiences? Like, where did it come from? What do you mean?
Right.
Why even say that? Does that not just like, even saying that, doesn't that just kind of play the duality card? You know what I mean?
Right. Right. Yeah. Eckhart Tolle says the West is the most mind-dominated culture ever to have existed. And I think that's true, even though we know, it's like what I was talking about before. We know there's a biology there. And if you're a hardline scientific materialist, then you argue that there's nothing but matter. There's nothing but the things that we can measure. And I also don't believe that to be true. I think it's much more likely that that's not true than that it is. Because just consider, for instance, bats communicate in a way that we don't. So they're seeing something, they're sensing something that we don't. I mean, we can with some of our tools, but the chances that there are things that are happening that things are happening that we can't sense, to me, seem much higher. That some of our tools can't pick up some of the things that are going on. So whatever we measure as matter, I feel like there has to be things that don't fit in that box. But science says it's just matter, it's just biology. But then our experience, because it's so mental, it's so oriented toward the mind and away from the body, tells us that, well, we're just kind of like floating above all of that. We're not a part of it. And that's why you'll get that sort of narrative in a study. It's like, well, yeah, there's this change in the person's mind, and that has a physical correlate, and we're surprised by that. How can you be surprised by that?
I know.
Or there's a change in someone's, we know, okay, exercising makes you less depressed. It's like, yeah. Yeah. And changing the way you're viewing things changes your biology. Like, yes. And that's the perspective. You got to know that, and you got to harness that and make use of it, because otherwise everything that's happening that you describe as yourself, this collation of experiences and atoms and so on, that's being determined by some other force, some blind force, culture mostly, whatever your culture is putting onto you. Whatever story your culture is telling you, that's the story you end up telling yourself, right? Which is why you experience culture shock when you go somewhere else. It's not that you went from a place where you felt comfortable. It's not about the change in the location. It's that you went to somewhere new where you didn't fit in. It's not the contrast between the two cultures. It's the effect the culture had on you as a being, as an organism, as an individual, that's felt when you go somewhere else. You go, man, I don't fit in here. Yeah, it's not that this culture just doesn't match my culture and my culture is a separate thing. It's that your culture is now stored in you. And so what we should be doing, and I've gone off track definitely from what you asked about it, but what we should be doing, it was about this, there's a physical correlate to some cognitive change. What we should be doing is observing, how did my culture condition me in ways that I would like not to have been conditioned, right? And then changing them for us. And that's why, like, we called the studio praxis. You have to practice something different. You have to replace that conditioning with a new form of conditioning, rather than just resenting your culture and going, well, this culture doesn't serve me. You can, it depends where you've grown up, where you're situated, but we're fortunate to be in what could be described as a free society, and I would describe it that way, where you have the option to go and recondition yourself for the better. Yeah, perhaps we can talk about that, more of that now or later if you'd like to. Not sure.
Well, we were going to get into environments and, how they affect us and how we might, transform our environments, and how we might be transformed by our environments. So, let's start getting into that.
Okay. This is one of my favorite topics. This is one of my favorite things to think about, is we know that we seem to be unique in our capacity to adapt to different environments. You leave your shoes outside and then you'll see a spider in there in a few days. So we're not unique. Every organism is adapting to its environment, but we're unique in the way that we transform our environments. And a beaver can build a dam, right? And then that changes its environment. It creates for itself a new niche. Yeah, this is called, biologists call this niche construction. Every organism, every species fits into a specific biological niche, right? The environment offers an opportunity for life, and then the species maps itself onto that environment in a way that allows it to survive and reproduce. But we can construct our own niches. And many animals can, but we do it in a way more extreme way. Like, just look, I mean, we're in a room. Just look around you, look at the human world around you, and compare it to the world that we evolved in, right? The environment that we evolved in before we started constructing cities and so on. It's like completely different. But our biology has not changed. We're the same animal. So we've also changed to adapt to that culturally. And that has an effect on our biology. So we want to consider that. Okay, we can change the world, and we have changed the world. And the way we like to change the world is to protect us, to satisfy our needs, to keep us safe. So that's why the supermarket is full of food. So I can just go and buy my food, and that need is satisfied. And it's been stormy here in Canberra today, and I don't care because I'm inside, because we have a house, and it's got a roof, and it's secure, and it's safe, and it's not leaky, and that's fantastic. So that need is, I don't have to worry about that need anymore. But it goes beyond that, right? To where maybe I have a need for comfort or a desire for comfort. So we start building other things like couches and chairs and comfy beds. And then we become dependent on that environment. And the same thing with the house example, right? Like, actually, if I go outside and it's raining heavily, I'm okay. But we can get so used to this new environment that we've created for ourselves that we lose some agency as individuals, that we lose some of those abilities. Or a great example is shoes, and everyone's talking about barefoot running and barefoot walking and everything, right? Like, we construct this technology that's intended to keep our feet protected and to cushion the foot and all these things. And then the foot becomes completely deformed and unable to remain resilient on its own. It becomes dependent on the thing that we constructed, on the tool that we made. And we depend on the world that we've made for ourselves 100%. The problem is that some of the things that we've done and that we continue to do aren't helpful. They're not benefiting us as individuals. The decisions on how the world is constructed, on the niches that we're creating for ourselves as a species or as a culture, aren't always made by the individuals. They're not always necessarily made by the people you'd like to have making them. And that can be a problem, because then you're completely tied into that. So this is something that I was studying actually at university, and I was looking at some of the Marxist ideas. One of the ideas there was, I don't identify so much with some of these ideas anymore, but some of them still resonate. If you just tore down the world that we've constructed for ourselves now, there's this idea that we need a revolution, right? That everyone's oppressed and no one's free. We need to create a free society. And the way we do that is by tearing down the one that we've constructed. And the person I was studying, Herbert Marcuse, he said, well, if you do that, then tomorrow everyone will just rebuild the existing environment. And we're seeing this happen live right now with the pandemic, right? There are all these changes that are happening because of the coronavirus pandemic. We have an opportunity for a clean slate. And what does everyone want more than anything? To go back to normal, right? Everyone wants to go back to normal, because your biology, you as an organism, you're completely adapted to the environment that we've created for ourselves. So where should the transformation happen? Should we transform the environment, tear it down, construct something new, or do we need to change ourselves? And the answer is actually both of those things, but it needs to be done incrementally. So you can start making these changes. Okay, the invention of the chair has immobilized me and given me stiff hips. Maybe I need to remove the chairs from my house and start sitting on the floor. And that's going to change my experience of having legs or having a spine. Or advertising is conditioning you, right? Conditioning you in all these ways that it's never conditioning you for your interests. The whole premise of advertising is you don't yet know that you need this thing. I'm going to convince you that you need it, and then I'm going to sell it to you. So stop watching TV, stop watching ads, change your environment, and that's going to make it easier to become the person that you want to be. So this is something that I've tried to take seriously, is like, let's be very careful about what we bring into our homes and bring into our worlds, and what do we surround ourselves with, because they make us who we are. And then also let's be careful about how we transform those things, because we need to start with ourselves, right? Like if you transform yourself first, if you take yourself and your habits and your routines as the object that you're going to transform, and start making changes there first, then if you made the wrong changes, only you suffer. But if I make large scale changes and I made a bad decision, which is very possible, everyone else suffers, right? So you start just with yourself. I'll just make this little change to myself. I'll start sitting on the floor rather than on a chair, to take a basic example, and I'll see what effect that has. Let me do that for a month every day. See what effect that has. Was it positive or negative? Okay, it was positive. Let's not bring the chairs back into the house. Or let's reintroduce them, but use them sparingly, or whatever. Those retreats with Simon Thakur, we spoke about it earlier. He runs these retreats in the bush. We haven't been able to do them this year, but you go away on those retreats, and because you don't look at tech, there's no screens for a week, right? There's no screens. There are really there's some artificial lighting, but it's just very different. You're actually in the bush, and living in that way. Every time I've come back from those retreats, it's just a week. It takes me a full day to be able to actually focus on my phone screen again. Like I can't focus on it, which just shocks me every time. And you come back into the city and you see the lights, the red lights, and they're such a shock to the system. Like that you oh my God, you're so alert. It's this reverse culture shock that you have. But then you think, okay, if that's the effect that just 1 week without that thing has on me, this stark difference when I return, what's happening when I'm just year upon year of exposure to bright lights and to screens? And how am I being conditioned in a way that's desensitizing me, right? Affecting my vision, affecting my entire organism in all these different ways. It can bring some attention to that, breaking that dependence on the environment that you're in, or breaking that relationship with it. And then you might decide, well, now that I've fasted on my phone for a week, I should use it less, right? Then you actually have some space to create, to make a decision, create a new habit, practice a different way of being. And that's what you'll end up becoming. So in my mind, we need to take a bit more autonomy over these things. The people that we respect are the ones who do that. The people that we admire are the people who have agency over how they act, how they carry themselves, and how they live out their lives. And they've made decisions about the environments they're going to put themselves in, about about their habitat, right? And about their habits as well. Another interesting, your habitat makes your habits, right? And those two things need to be transformed together. And I think the important thing to remember is that neither of those things are thoughts, right? Because there's a story that you can just change the way you think, and that's going to change your world. And that's true, but it's very hard to change the way you think without changing your habitat and without changing your habits. Because again, we've got this central tube, and then this animal layer, the habitual, the unconscious layer, and then this conscious layer on top of that, and then the environment outside of that. And they're all feeding back and forth. So any serious self-transformation, if you're interested in pursuing that, needs to engage all of the layers, not just the cognitive layer, not just changing how you think. Because we know those things are connected, right? What do you do when you've got a headache? How do you treat the people around you? What are the thoughts that come up when you're anxious? You had too many cups of coffee. Your mind starts going, what are we anxious about? And attaching that feeling that you're already having in the body to different ideas that are coming up. Oh, I think it's that thing. I think it's that thing. There's this interplay that's happening, and lots of it's emerging bottom up, right? Out of the body and out of the environment in which the body's embedded. So there are some things to consider that I think are definitely worth considering.
So, the way that you conceptualized that there was kind of like the central tube and the metabolic layer, and then the animal layer, and then the cognitive layer, and then the environment. Like what kind of, if you were to draw that, would that kind of be a pyramid with the environment on the bottom and then the metabolic layer? Or would that be like a circle with the metabolic layer on the middle, and then animal, and then cognitive, and then environment? Like how do you What do you reckon?
Yeah, it's more like the concentric circles.
Right.
The concentric circles like that. And this is a distinction that Aristotle had made as well. I spoke about him earlier, between this like nutritive, he talked about different elements of the soul, or different souls. He's just talking about different traits or essential aspects that we have in ourselves, in us. This nutritive center, and then the animal layer that's outside of that, the locomotive layer, the sensing layer. And to sense is to desire. So when I see something, I immediately either want it or don't want it. I want to move toward it or move away from it. That's precognitive. Yeah, we can influence that cognitively, consciously. But every animal has that. Every cell has that. It can either move towards something, be attracted by it, or move away from it, be repelled by it. Yeah. And then that rational layer that comes after that in the evolutionary process, and the environmental layer, the world in which everything is embedded. And they're all feeding back and forth. So, all these distinctions that we make, they're made by the mind, right? So we're separating things out so that we can try to understand them, which is a valid pursuit. But they're all part of one big soup in reality. But I like the concentric circle idea, and that if you're going to make changes, that they should start closer to the center of those concentric circles.
So why, in my university degree, and I think, in the common kind of consciousness, we definitely know or appreciate in some ways how changing our environments and our thoughts can, change us and the world. But, the whole animal layer that is kind of, ruled by habit and repetition and practice, that's only for gym people, and not even a specific gym person, but actually a conscious moving person, which is an incredibly small population of the entire exercise world as well. Why does that layer, even diet is such a huge thing, and everyone's tried diets and everyone's heard of this and that, but no one, as far as I come across, really knows or understands much about like the idea of conscious movement and repetition and habits and practice, and how that can change yourself and the world from an inside to out or a bottom up kind of perspective.
Well, perhaps there are two things to talk about there. And the first would be why, to answer your question directly, why don't we see that truth about ourselves? And the second, which I'd really love to come back to, is the subset, the gym, how people who do move, the fitness culture, a little bit about our physical culture in general, I think would be worth discussing. So to try to go to your first question, or directly to your question, it's the arrogance of the intellect again. It's this tendency we have I have this narrating brain, there it is again, mind, right? This story that's being played, the thoughts that are unfolding in every moment. And Ralph Waldo Emerson said this, right? Man is what he thinks about all day long, something along those lines. So we really experience ourselves that way. We think, well, I'm just my thoughts, the cogito, right? I think, therefore I am. René Descartes, everyone knows that. And that really does pervade. But 99% of the things you do aren't conscious. 99% of the things you do every day aren't things that you decided to do. They're just habits. They're just routines that you've gotten into. So the first time you drive to a new place, right? You get in your car, you check the map, or you use Google Maps, and that takes you there. And okay, this is the route. And then you do that a couple of times, and maybe you have to be conscious of it the first few times. But then it's just a routine. And this is a special skill we have to shine that light of awareness onto some specific thing, one detail, and allow everything else to be automated, right? Because then the next time you drive, you don't even think about, you're thinking about something else, or you're on the phone, or you're listening to a podcast, because you don't need to focus. Now you know how to get there, and you don't need to decide which route will I take today. You just go. It just happens. Most of what happens in your life is like that. We're just repeating machines. Machines, there it is again. We're just repeating organisms where we get used to something. It becomes normal, and we do it again and again and again and again. And we know that bad habits are hard to break. And I always say, like, no one decided to build a bad habit, right? They're built all on their own. So that's the other thing, is most of your habits just happened. They just emerged, and many of them aren't serving you. But the story, the narrating self, this cognitive layer, is convinced that it's making all the decisions. Often it's just telling a story about a decision that was already made. So you walk past a particular vendor selling food, and you're hungry, and you decide, I'm going to go get that. And then maybe it's not the healthiest food, right? And you already find yourself walking over to buy that thing that you've decided you're going to eat. And then walking away, you go, I really deserve this. Like, I've worked hard and I've been eating well and I've trained hard today. Some story emerges. And then someone else later says, dude, what are you doing eating McDonald's? Maybe. And you tell them the story that you came up with after you made the decision to eat McDonald's. That's the reason. You say, this is the reason I decided. It's bullshit. It's not at all. The decision was made before you thought about it. And there are studies on this, right? Where this is the whole free will thing, and we shouldn't go into that because it's going to be a whole other topic. But that most of the decisions, and perhaps all of the decisions that you make, are made before you're conscious of the decision being made. They happen. It's intuition. They're happening automatically. So that's the thing to be aware of. Where the mind is very convincing. It will compel you. It will convince you that it's responsible for everything that's going on. And the thing is, it actually can be. But the only way it does that is by feeding back into that unconscious layer, that pre-conscious layer. Yeah. So you can become aware of a tendency you have. You can become conscious of a tendency. Every time it might be every time I see a stranger, I tighten up, my shoulders come up, and I've got this like aversion. You become conscious of that. And that's like, wow, what an insight. Thank you. Something, because we don't really know where thoughts come from, but somehow they arise. And then you can go, I'm going to recondition myself. I'm going to try to make it so that every time I see a stranger, I'm open and positive toward that person. And you might start practicing that. You might make a habit of practicing that. And that's what meditation, like that's what all the mindfulness traditions, that's what they're about, is repatterning your subconscious reactions, your pre-conscious reactions or responses to things. So there is actually this interplay, which I think is really special, that you can become aware of your nature, or perhaps your second nature, right? Because we talk about things becoming a second nature, and my nature isn't fixed. Like, okay, I have my human nature, and that's all the things associated with that. But we already spoke about the extent to which human nature is defined by plasticity. It's defined by its malleability and the fact that we can change it. And it's the conscious mind that can make, and we spoke about this before as well, can make top-down changes, can notice something and decide, I want to be a more empathic person. How do I become a more empathic person? I need to start shining my awareness on other people's emotions more than on my own. And then you can develop that attribute if you want it. Or maybe you want to be a more athletic person. And then so you decide to become a more athletic person, and then you go take up a sport and you build a new second nature for yourself. And then that starts feeding you different messages, right? So this is the process, is something emerges as like, I'd like to become more this and less that. And unfortunately, often we stop at that level because it just seems too hard. I'd like to be more honest. And you just stop there because you just can't stop yourself from lying, because those pre-conscious decisions are just too quick and too powerful. And the bad habits you've developed are too strong because they've been developed over such a long period of time. But if you resist and change your actions, and this is where the world of ideas, the abstract world, connects with the physical world through action. If you change your actions, one tiny little thing at a time, eventually a new habit is constructed, a new second nature is constructed. And that's a really amazing thing, that we have that capacity. And that does seem unique to me, that we can decide to change ourselves and actually set out about doing that. The important thing to remember there is that deciding is not enough. You have to do the work. You have to do the work. And too often we just go, I'd like this different life, and we're not good at connecting. We're not as good as we'd like to be at connecting where I'm at now to where I want to be. And we don't even know where exactly we want to be. That's where the intuition comes in. But to go to that second point about, well, how are people who are working on that animal layer, this physical part of us, on the organism as a whole, how are they perceived and how are they doing it in our culture? And that's where I think we need to also criticize, be critical toward that to some extent, because that's been dominated, and this might not be the case for people working inside of it who are actually doing training, who are actually training, but at least it's how it's perceived by the majority of the population. And the vast majority of people aren't engaged in some regular sort of training of themselves. And I really love that word training, because that's the word we use to describe what I'm talking about, this ability to change our second nature, to change ourselves fundamentally at the organic level. It's being done again in this shallow, objectified way, objectifying the body. Why do people train? What's the most common reason that you think people would give for why they would train, or what they think the reason that people train physically is?
Because if they didn't, then they would receive some bad things for not training.
Right.
Or because they have to. I have to exercise, right?
Right. But why? Like, what's the reason? Like, what are the bad things that you experience if you don't train?
Maybe
putting you on the spot, man.
Diabetes, sickness, different cancers, but also, the kind of, I think they're also kind of maybe an aversion to the thought of suffering that we know from science will happen if we don't exercise our brain taxis.
Right. Yeah. I would say I agree with you. There's health as a primary orientation, and another is appearance.
Oh yeah.
Right. Not being fat.
Yes.
Looking a certain way. I want my body to look a certain way, because if it looks a way that's not considered attractive, I'm less likely to reproduce. And if it looks a way that is, I'm more likely to reproduce. And then, that back to that problem of the mind, very unfortunately being trapped in a body. If I don't look after that, then I'll die, right? So they're the two main concerns. Don't die, do reproduce. They're the fundamental concerns of every organism.
True.
Don't die, do reproduce, right? So that's what they're tied to. But unfortunately, that the forms of training that emerge from the desire, for instance, to create a body that looks a certain way, what they create is a body that looks a certain way, but doesn't perform in the way that it looks like it would perform, right? So the orientation is toward building a competent looking physique rather than physical competence itself. But the reason that a competent looking physique is attractive is because it implies physical competence, right? So think about women, and I'm generalizing, of course, because that's what you have to do in conversations, but a woman finding a man's body attractive because he's muscular, right? Okay, that implies that he can defend himself and perhaps her, and that he can procure, that he can hunt well. That's the implication. You're physically competent. That's going to be good for us, for our survival, right? And the survival of our offspring. So again, ticking those boxes. Don't die, do reproduce, keep your offspring alive, right? But the training we've decided to opt for, we've chosen this replica, the appearance of competence over competence itself. It's the same mistake we make when watch a car. Next time you're watching you do see ads, advertisements. If that happens to you, watch for what's always advertised in car ads. It's generally one of two things, either freedom or adventure. And I think the reason is that they're the two things that people feel they're lacking the most: freedom in their lives and adventure. And buying a new car is like the largest purchase that you can make, basically, for most people. So because we're so used to solving our problems by making purchases, because there's this connection between needs and commodities that we can also discuss, which is generated through advertising, right? Advertising connects needs, if it doesn't fabricate them, needs that you might actually feel, to commodities that are available for you to purchase. So the car ad is selling freedom or adventure. And you buy the car, right? Maybe you invest a lot of money in the car and you have to take out a loan to buy this expensive car because the ad was really compelling. And you're like, man, you're getting a car, but what you've been sold is freedom. But then you get the car and now you've got a car loan and you're working in a job that you hate and you have to work more hours to pay off the car. So actually you traded freedom for the appearance of freedom. You traded freedom for a car, which the advertiser convinced you would give you freedom. And we make the same mistake in our training. We trade a physically competent body for a body that looks physically competent, but actually can't move for shit. It's the same mistake. You're opting for the replica over the genuine original. And that's why Coca-Cola ads, they never say anything about the drink because they know they can't sell you on that. Like, everyone knows how it tastes. They have to sell you on some other experience that you're going to be at a party and everyone's going to be drinking Coca-Cola. Like, when has that ever happened? And you go in and you buy it and you drink it and it tastes good, and that's a physical response. So intellectually you're sold on, I'm going to be partying and having a great time drinking Coke. Physically you're sold because it tastes good. But none of your needs, the needs were not actually satisfied. You didn't get that feeling that you thought you would get, that everyone was having in the advertisement. So yeah, that's the dominant perspective in the physical culture that we're in, is it's still treating the body as this object that can do things for us. If I have an attractive body, I'm more likely to reproduce. And if I have a healthy body through my exercise routine, then I'm less likely to die. And it's just still quite superficial, and I think there are much deeper layers there that you can engage in, that you can reach through the practice, and that they should be pursued in the same way that a superficial relationship, where maybe it's transactional, in a friendship or a romantic relationship, we all know those relationships, how they can be transactional and lack depth, that feels different from a relationship where there's genuine connection there. And the body is the exact same way. We can have this superficial relationship with it where it's transactional, or a more whole relationship, a deeper relationship with our physical experience, with our experience of embodiment. And I do think there's something there, and something that I feel you miss out on, and we miss out on, when we don't respect that and pursue that. Because, we're here. Why not? Why not try to engage fully in everything? Why not try to have the most profound, deepest possible experience of everything that you're doing? Why sit here, have this conversation, and let my mind wander and be thinking about something else, right? Why? We have this opportunity to be fully in this moment now. So let's do that in everything. And that includes the training. Why not be fully in the body rather than thinking about something else, watching the TV screen on your treadmill while you do your fitness, while you do the necessary work that you really hate doing, just to make sure that your body's more likely to reproduce and less likely to die. I mean, it's because what else? What's that in service of? And this is the question that we don't ask, because we've got all these means and no ends. This instrumentalization of everything in service of what? I don't know.
Yeah. And it's, even if, it strikes me as well that even if, looking good and your body surviving is the goal, a static analysis will tell you that, well, you can just shortcut it, optimize the process, get swollen 6 weeks, and you'll tick both of those boxes. But a dynamic analysis and a analysis taken over time will tell you need to be identified with and engaged within some kind of, practice or cumulative process of experiencing your body for you to have a continual investment in it. And the amount of people that, it's like, how many 70-year-old bodybuilders are there that were bodybuilders when they were 20? Every single bodybuilder like Ronnie Coleman documentaries just come out.
I was thinking about him just this morning.
He's not a bodybuilder
the guy's
anymore.
On crutches. His whole spine's fused. Like, oh my God.
and Dorian Yates, and he's been on podcasts as well.
He completely traded appearance for competence.
Yeah.
He completely traded what his body would look like. And, fair play, do what you will. And he says himself that he doesn't regret it, but he traded what his body would look like through those years when he was, the greatest bodybuilder in the world, for an experience of his body now.
And I think that so many people might use those examples as justification for their passive, bodybuilding mentality towards their body. And I don't think there's anything wrong with the bodybuilding mentality, but it's just actually do it. You know, like Ronnie Coleman was like, I'm going to be the most swole dude ever. And all the professional bodybuilders and men and women who are taking it really seriously and consciously engaging in that process and getting the pump and getting the squeeze and being in their bodies when they're training, because otherwise they're not going to be the best. That's super legitimate. Sure, they're not going to, you know, it's built off upon the idea that, you know, we like big muscles because it helps you reproduce and be, you know, physically competent. So therefore we've taken that meme to the extreme and we're kind of embodying the abstract form of that, but at least they're doing it really consciously. If you want to have
anything taken to the extreme lacks longevity, right? So
yeah, and same thing with athletes, right?
If it's a decision, if it's a conscious decision that you've made, then I respect that. Like, and maybe we can talk. You keep going, but about how the movement perspective is presented to newcomers, because I think it touches on that. You know, to people who are outside of it.
Yeah. I was just going to say that, you know, it circles back in towards athletes as well, and you know, this kind of movement perspective, I think, is so beneficial towards athletes. But the more I'm, you know, getting into it and working with athletes, the more I realize that athletes don't care about enjoying their body. It's all about the W, you know, it's about winning now. And again, that's super valid. If you want to win the gold medal, then that's fine. And it's hard to convince them to pay more to build the foundation from the bottom, as opposed to just have a skinny one, because that's, you know, they've only got 1 or 2 years left anyway, and they're nursing 5 injuries that they're not telling the coach about, and they're on $3 million a year and they're supporting a family. So that then they can't listen to you. They don't want to listen to you, you know? And it's,
but make that decision, you know, make that decision. Like, okay, I'm going to sacrifice my body to this office job for 5 years, and I'm going to be a CEO, you know, I'm going to go hard at that. And I'm going to be the CEO and I'm going to make a lot of money. And that's my goal. That's what I'm going to do. And whatever your goal is, you sacrifice things to it, right? And maybe you sacrifice your family or the prospect of a family to that goal as well. But let's do it consciously and be aware that there is a sacrifice. There's a price being paid there when we make those decisions about this body. And the price is a big one, because like we said, in so many ways, your body makes you who you are. And maybe you make that sacrifice and you trade your body, you trade your embodiment for money or accolades, you know, fame, whatever. It's going to pay you back, you know, that's going to come back to you. Your body's going to resent you for that. And that means you're going to resent yourself for that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, just to finish off this point that I was saying, in terms of, if you want to truly have the aesthetic body that will increase your reproductive success, or the body that's not going to fail you and leave you with some debilitating illness at 60, then as I was saying, the way to do it is not through these short, quick kind of, you know, shortcuts. You don't see the people who have gone on that path actually succeeding. And I think from a static analysis, as I was saying, it does make sense, but in a dynamic analysis, it doesn't make sense. And you know, your continual kind of practice in the body is the thing that makes you, you know, it's like how much, you know, for example, getting shredded, low body fat, you know, it's like, how much more important is that to a rock climber that has to pull their weight and every single bit of fat up the wall, that loves climbing so much that they'll climb until their fingers bleed every single day? It doesn't have to think about exercise. And lo and behold, have you seen a climber without their shirt on? 99% of the time, they're shredded out of their mind. That you know, that if they walked into a gym, everyone would be like, damn, what are you on? What gives you program? And they're like, I just love climbing.
Right.
Know?
Yeah. Like, normally if you actually cultivate physical competence and orient toward that instead, the full expression of your physical potential, then you end up with the physique you deserve. This is a George Orwell quote. Everyone at 50, everyone has the face he deserves. And it's so true. Like, what you've done through that time and the way you've engaged with the world, whether it's with a little bit of a frown or a smile or whatever, that's how that's stored in your face. And
yeah, that's so
quote,
true, man.
It's the exact same with the body, man. And that like 6-week abs approach is like, it's like the father who's never there because he's too busy working and then takes the family on a holiday. And it's like, now it's fine. Band-Aid, right?
Yeah.
But what do the kids remember when they grow up? It's not the holidays. It's he wasn't there. And the moments that they do remember is, it's those little moments where, oh, remember when we used to do this thing that cost us nothing, but time. Cost us nothing but the investment of time, right? Or you see this with sometimes new houses that are built. They completely demolish raise everything on the property, build up this fantastic, beautiful thing, and with a lawn, and within a year the lawn's dead because it was not made for the climate that it's in. It's like a completely superficial construction that just doesn't last. And it's the same with the body. It's the same with that approach to training. Although you have to respect it as well. Like maybe your orientation is different, and you don't, and just doing 30 minutes a day, that's all you can do, or 30 minutes 3 times a week. But I still think if that's the case, we could make improvements on what that time is spent on.
Of course. That's the thing, man. So many people are already spending, $60 a week and 4 hours a week to go in and, thrash around in a group class that they have to drag themselves out of bed to. It's like, I know just from, being as one of your students and getting into this world, how much you can do with that amount of time,
Right. And it's just the same. It just takes some effort and some actual conscious awareness in that moment, to be in that moment. Exact same. Like if we're talking about the relationship that a parent can develop with a child, or that you can develop with your partner, you might not be able to see each other often. Let's say that's the case. But if you're fully there when you're together, and you're fully there for that person, which takes effort, it's enough. It's enough. Most people will trade many hours of superficial interactions where we're both out at lunch together looking at our iPhones for 30 minutes of actually really being there for that person, and really listening and really engaging, and not letting your mind wander. Like, I'm fully here for you. And the it's just another thing to have in a relationship. It's just, it's your self relationship. You're cultivating a relationship with yourself. And the thing is, everything else stems from that self, from you. It stems from what's in you. It stems from the work that you've done on yourself. And we know that, right? And people do make this mistake where they put a lot of effort into cultivating a relationship with someone else, but not enough effort into their self development. And that relationship with the other person will ultimately fall apart because there's nothing on the other end of it, right? So it's that concentric circle idea again. Invest in yourself. Make yourself a person that's going to be useful and reliable and strong and flexible, also, and adaptable, and invest in that relationship with yourself. And then that will ripple out and affect all of those other circles, out into the world. And that's the perspective I try to adopt. I would encourage people to do that,
I want to get into how we communicate this to, as you were saying, people who are coming into the community or people who are unfamiliar with this terminology. But I do want to quickly touch on, is so much of this is built off awareness and conscious choices, and, being there when you're moving and being curious about it, which is another part of that, and what you're going to find. And almost, with enough curiosity, courage, and compassion towards your current experience, like you never need to read a book again. You know what I mean? You could just be there and learn the things you actually need to learn for your actual environment or whatever. But, obviously we need to read books and everything like that. But is consciousness and awareness really the meta skill or the fundamental thing that is at the bottom of the pyramid? Or is there, what do you think?
I think everyone's experience is determined by what they pay attention to. I actually think that's the best way to conceptualize yourself. I'm something that pays attention. That's what consciousness does, right? It can be oriented in different directions. It's like a light, like a torch. You can shine it on whatever you want. And when we're talking about developing self-consciousness, some self-awareness, what we're talking about is harnessing that capacity and actually deciding where you're going to shine that light, deciding what you're going to pay attention to. So I think of that as that's the meta skill, is what am I paying attention to, and how do I change it for the better? How do I focus on something else? Because you see the world through the lens of your pursuits, right? So whatever you've set up as your top goal, your top objective, your top priority, which is essentially your God, your version of God, right? What is the top thing that you're moving towards? That's going to determine what you pay attention to. Yeah. And blinkers go on and you don't see anything else. So we have to consider that. And I think in terms of developing a skill that's going to transform your life, develop the skill of paying attention and deciding what you pay attention to, which is why why we have that discussion about what am I exposing to myself to when I go on social media. This is why I don't follow very many accounts. Is I'm very specific. I've curated for myself very specifically what I want to pay attention to. And that can be problematic too, because there's always things outside of the frame that you created for yourself, outside of the little word you created for yourself. This echo chamber problem is a real, genuine problem. So we have to pay attention to that too. But that's the skill. And I do think that everyone has that ability, that capacity to change what they're paying attention to. Many of us, most of the day, we're paying attention to our thoughts, and most of those thoughts are negative concerns about, regrets about the past, and worries about the future. That's what most of our experience is comprised of, which is why that quote I mentioned before, we become those concerns. So we want to develop that skill, and all a teacher can do is make a suggestion. Try paying attention to this. Try orienting in this direction. Try feeling this. Try this and notice what it feels like. Put your awareness in that fully. That's all that we can suggest. But what you're doing internally, I mean, that's at the end of the day, it is up to you. And I think that's cool. That's lucky us. We can make that decision if we want to.
So does that mean that meditation, 3 questions. Is meditation the best tool to, develop that awareness? And also, can we really have a successful movement practice in the fullest sense possible without a meditation practice? Only 2 questions.
I think it's different for different people, the meditation front. What I like about meditation is that it allows you to pay attention to all the things that are happening when you're not doing anything else. And it's that same buzz that I mentioned, noticing coming back from retreats in the bush, the buzz of the city, of the lights, of the noises, that now you hear them all of a sudden again, but they're there the whole time. It's the same with your thoughts and your emotions and the state that you're in. It's there and it's causing things to happen. And meditation is just an opportunity to be still and just pay attention to that. So I do think that's it's such a fundamental skill. And I don't know if you can develop awareness of certain other things, but that self-awareness of the awareness of awareness, very hard to develop in something that isn't a meditation practice or looks like a meditation practice. I don't know of anything. You might develop awareness of certain parts of the body, for instance, through a physical practice. But what about the awareness of your emotional state? And what about the awareness of your habitual patterns of thought and so on? I think it's very hard to develop if you're not meditating in some way. And then, in terms of the movement practice, I think what's happened with this seemingly new approach, where we're combining lots of things together and just calling it movement, is that lots of people are engaging in that in a profoundly unaware way, an unconscious way, and just building up a repertoire of skills and physical attributes. And, there's this, what's the book? Franny and Zoe. I forget the author. One of the characters. I wish I had better memory for these sorts of references. But she basically compares the accumulation of money, because they're all criticizing, that desire to accumulate wealth, and replacing it with the accumulation of knowledge through reading books. But it's all an accumulation. And there's something perverse there in those desires to build up and accumulate and basically protect yourself against the world. Because it's a losing game at the end of the day. Not to discount the development of knowledge or the acquisition of wealth or the accumulation of physical skills or attributes. There does need to be, I think, an awareness underlying that. And that's what you're really cultivating. Is what you're cultivating is when I'm juggling, for instance, how does that affect my visual system? And how does that affect on my visual system affect my state? And does that put me in a state that could be useful elsewhere? And the answer is actually yes, in many instances. And it might be that it's very useful in a disagreement with a colleague or with the boss, or that shifting into that state where you're absorbing everything in front of you, to use the example of juggling, rather than focusing on one specific thing. That might be the exact state you need to access when you're trying to successfully resolve your dispute with a colleague or with a partner or with your boss. And now you have a touchstone for that state. I learned that state through juggling. I don't care about learning how to juggle. What I care about is what is that new mode of being that it gives me access to. And I don't care about being strong, but developing strength allows you to have that access to that state of resisting. Sometimes you need to resist and stand strong and say, no, this is where I stand on this topic. This is my belief and I'm standing by that. Or this, I believe in this person and I'm standing by them. And I have the resilience, the strength to do that, partly because I did a physical practice that helped me feel that, helped me feel what that feels like so I can access it elsewhere. Same for fluidity. Oh, this is a situation where I need to go with the flow. Good thing I did all that fluid spinal movement, because now I actually know what that feels like, going with the flow feels like. I have this physical referent, which we really do need. Like, we need an experiential reference, a clear touchstone, which I think is it's a nice term for it, if I don't say so myself, for every concept, for everything. It's just like, I like the example of every parent says, oh, you don't know what it's like until you have a child. Well, they're probably right. They're probably right. You don't know what true love is like until you have a child, really, really loving and caring for someone and putting them ahead of yourself until you have a child. It's like, all right, well, there's probably something to that. And for me, the physical practice is about going, which states have I never accessed? Which states don't I like accessing? Which states am I afraid of? And for me, it's always the letting go states, the releasing. And for other people, it'll be the opposite. They love letting go and going with the flow. And for them, they're not good at control, at taking control and making the decisions themselves. So that's what I really love about it, is you can cultivate the ability to access those states. And also it gives you an awareness of the states that you tend not to want to access. Where are your fears? Where are you, for me, it's acrobatics in the physical domain. And why is that? Well, you have to go all at once and go for it. You can't control. You start the movement and then you end the movement, but you can't decide in the middle of it whether or not to proceed. It's all in. Yeah. It's all in one moment. Boom, we're doing it. Some people, no problem. Do that any day of the week, but you try to get them holding a handstand for 60 seconds and they've got the skill, the ability, the physical attributes to do it, but they just can't focus and stay focused on one thing for that long. So that's their project. There's always an underlying skill or state that you're accessing and cultivating and developing. And all it's doing is making you a more adaptable version of yourself, a more complete version of yourself.
So, a 60-second handstand is the sexy thing that's going to bring the beginner in, or what, constitutes a lot of the end goal of people's practices, even in the movement, in inverted commas, community. As we're saying, how do you educate people in that? It's easy to bust a one-arm pull-up for people to see that, for them to come to you and you bust a one-arm pull-up and then you teach them. But, how do we start to make the stuff that's inside the container sexy instead of just the container? And how do we start to communicate that? That's like the main challenge that I find.
Yeah, it is the main challenge. I tend now to adopt a more flexible approach to how I do that. And in the beginning, which is the case with most people when they go into something new, is we're more dogmatic about it. That's always our tendency. Either you engage with the movement practice for the reasons I do, or fuck off. That's how you're greeted sometimes, when you step into something. But that's an ego move. That's a move where I'm going, either you're fully on board with me from the get-go and you'll submit to my views on the topic, or I don't want you involved. And I think if you actually want to help people, or you believe you want to help people, and we never know fully what our motivations are, but I like to think that I genuinely want to help people, and at least I'm trying to act in that way, then you need to meet them where they are, right? It's this entrainment thing. So here's an example. Yesterday afternoon, I taught a handstand class, and the weather was kind of rubbish all day, and you can feel the vibe in the group, feel the energy of the group. It was a bit low. People weren't really socializing. They're just kind of waiting for the class to start. And I was like, all right, we're going to pick the energy up. So I we have a Funky Friday playlist, which is like all classics. And we did it was a handstand class, but I was like, well, to open the shoulders and get them prepped, we're going to do some arm swings and some patterns moving down the room and dance around a little bit and feel the energy of the music and pick up the energy. Completely failed. I was feeling energized, but the group was not feeling energized at all. And they were almost feeling worse than before we'd done it, and it was because I just came in. Yeah. It was because I came in and I didn't meet them where they were at all. It would have been better if, okay, let's ease into this and then slowly bring the energy up. Just like if let's say you had a bad day and you come home and you say to your partner, oh man, I've just had a bad day. I'm a bit miserable. And they're like, what's wrong? Come on, cheer up. It's like the worst thing to hear. You have to kind of, oh, that's no good. You have to meet them at their level and then bring them, hopefully guide them toward like where you'd like them to be, not where you want them to be, but where you'd like for them to want to be. You really feel that they should be. And I think it's the same thing with engaging with new people in the movement domain. And it's something that's not happened partly because the people who are at the forefront of this movement, which is the case for anyone who's at the forefront of any movement, are radical, right? Movement is the one thing, like I've learned from Ido, and he's probably had the biggest influence on the community, on the movement culture. And he's radical, right? It's like movement is everything. That's what I'm orienting towards is my top thing. But the single mother with 3 children who just wants to feel a little bit more comfortable in her body, but has way more important priorities than her movement practice, why should she not benefit from it? Movement for her can be just one thing. And maybe something that she's overlooked and would benefit from paying a bit more attention to again. But so she needs to be met where she is. And when someone comes in and maybe they saw the handstand, the one-arm handstand, and that's what they want more than anything in the world. Okay, you want to learn a one-arm handstand? Come to handstand class. And what you're giving them, what you want to give them is not the one-arm handstand. I mean, eventually perhaps, but what you really need to give them is the experience of self-transformation. You give them the experience of, I saw this person do a one-arm handstand and I practiced, I trained, and now I'm closer to being that person myself. That's what you want to give them. That's where the magic is. And then they can apply that in any domain. And that's what you want to have happen. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important. Accept people where they are, engage with them where they've come in, not in a way where you move so far away from your values that now you're a weight loss center and you want it to be a movement facility, but engage with them where they are. Acknowledge that often we think we want things that we don't actually, we express a desire for something, which is actually a desire for something else, something deeper. And I think that's an important thing to acknowledge. Maybe the person comes in because they want to look a certain way, but they want to look a certain way because they want people to treat them in a certain way. And the reason they're not being treated that way is because they don't have self-esteem. And the reason they don't have self-esteem is because they're not physically competent. They can't do the things they'd like to be able to do. So actually what they want is physical competence, but that's articulated as a desire for a certain appearance, for instance. And I do think that's the case. We have these true deeper needs and they get kind of different expressions, which is what culture does, satisfies needs in different ways. That's a good definition for culture. Italian culture, cuisine is a good example for it. Everyone's hungry, but we're all fulfilling that need in different ways based on where we were born, right? I've lost my train of thought. Oh, so it's acknowledging, it's looking to connect that person with their deeper need gradually. Don't slam the door in their face and say, oh, we don't do, no, we don't focus on aesthetics here. Like, we don't. But maybe they'll look better. Maybe they'll get that and they'll get something they wanted. And for lots of people, and it's sad, but it's true for lots of us, just getting something that we wanted is a new experience, and seeing that we can do that just by repeating, by just showing up. Just show up every day and do the thing that takes you in the direction of what you wanted. And it's going to be such a small thing that it feels like you're making no progress, but cumulative gains, right? You make a little bit of progress every single day. And after a year, that's an insane amount of progress. And you might be a completely different person. So I think that is something that we could do better in the movement culture, in this community, is just accepting where people are and extending the hand and bringing them in on the premise of satisfying that desire that they think they have. And then with time, like I said before, you might just nudge and go like, hey, I know you like the handstand classes, but you should try one of these movement practice classes. Or they're really strong and you go, try a mobility class. Just come and see what you think. And you start giving them some other things that maybe they didn't know they need, but they desperately need, right? With time. And maybe they'll never get to where you'd like them to get, but they'll get to where they're supposed to get to. And you kind of just have to, I think, accept that as the teacher.
Switching gears now, we talked about before this chaos and order in movement practice. What do you mean by that, and how do you conceptualize those two forces within the movement practice?
Yeah, I think people need a different dosages of the different things. And we touched on it a little bit already with the noticing what your personality, what your inclination is, your temperamental inclinations are, and where your fears lie, and giving yourself a bit of a dose of that. So there's an argument between these two extremes, like that you and I have also spoken about this before in the context of, we can learn intuitively, right? Give someone a task, don't tell them how to complete it, and just see what happens. Eventually they might learn it or they might not, but it's like the baptism by fire almost. Maybe you want to learn how to fight. Let's use this as an example to go through it. Maybe you want to learn how to fight. And so the first day you step into the gym and you're sparring. First day, just get in there. You're going to learn eventually how to fight to some extent, right? It'll work in a way eventually. There might be a lot of harm caused along the way, yeah? And that's one extreme. That's the chaos extreme. Get in and just do it. No technical instruction. Just try to win. Just try to succeed. Complete chaos. And then the ordered extreme is you come in and we're practicing jabs. Okay, we're just practicing the front hand shots. Just a jab, but you can't throw it properly yet. So tomorrow we're also practicing the jab. And the next day we're also practicing the jab. And we're going to keep practicing the jab until you can throw it perfectly, right? But then you get into a sparring situation and they're a little bit off exactly where you practice throwing your jab. And so it doesn't land and it doesn't work at all. This happens with language. It's probably even a better example. Like you prepare the perfect sentence in this other language that you're trying to learn. And then you say it and then they respond and you're like, oh my God, this is too chaotic. And then the chaotic extreme in that example would be someone who can converse, but it's a mess. And everyone knows, okay, you never really learned the language. You just learn how to get by with it. So I think the skill of a teacher in part is determining where people are, what their tendencies are. Maybe you get a physiotherapist in, strength and conditioning coach in, their first class ever. I'll immediately try to give that person some more chaos because their world is so linear and structured and ordered that you need to remind them that they're an organic being that doesn't, that actually life doesn't conform to your lines, I'm afraid. And here's a chaotic situation, which will make that obvious to you, where all your training is not going to work without injuring them, right? Because you can make a point of this and then you're just harming people to make a point. And I don't think there's value in that. A little bit of harm, a little ego death, but not physical death.
Yeah.
And then the other extreme, you get someone in there like, oh man, I just like moving however I feel, and, you know, just feeling the music and moving according to that. And they've got another barrier, which is that they can't do reps. They don't like structure. And that's going to put a limitation on where they can reach as well in their own development. It's putting a artificial ceiling on their potential. So you go, well, for you, the next 6 weeks, we're going to do this training program every Monday, and this session every Tuesday, and this session every Wednesday. And you're just going to repeat for 6 weeks, and we'll see what effect that has on you. And it has a real effect. And maybe they start bringing some structure and discipline into other areas of their life. So that's kind of how I would respond to that question. Notice, what is the person coming in with? What's their inclination? Is it a leaning always towards order? Is it leaning always towards freedom and chaos? Because actually it's a combination of the two that makes them what they could be, or takes them closer to what they could be. And also acknowledging yourself as the teacher. This has been a big one for me. What's my inclination? What's my background? Like often you'll hear the people who are advocating just completely intuitive, open, chaotic learning situations. They had an incredibly structured, disciplined training regimen earlier in their lives, where they were working, you know, in athletics or in a specific sport, or in gymnastics. And then they're relying on that and leaning on that very heavily, that highly ordered work that they've done on their body to express in this chaotic domain. But none of their students have done that. So you have to acknowledge that as well. What's your background and how's it affecting things? So ultimately we need to be exposed to both. I think when people come in generally, their bodies are in a state of chaos, simply because there's not attention being paid there. And there's so little attention being paid there. And this is just sadly the truth for the general population. This was the truth for me as well, that they don't even know what's wrong with them. I remember seeing a physio when I had first had my back injury, and just doing a forward bend test. And he said, I stopped, you know, I couldn't touch the floor. I couldn't get my hands I couldn't get my hands to my ankles with straight legs. And he said, well, do you feel pain, and where do you feel the pain? And I was like, I don't know. He says, is your lower back or is it your hamstrings? And I was like, it's everywhere. I just can't. I didn't even have the sensitivity to distinguish where I was feeling the stretching sensation or the pain signal in my body. It was such a zoomed out body map. Canberra, Australia, pale blue dot, you know, that sort of zoom out. And that's what you're getting with a lot of people. Such chaos that their body has just been exposed only to blind forces. And like I said earlier, usually the blind forces don't send you in the direction you'd like them to. They're serving some other purpose. So they're sitting in an office job 8 hours a day. The body's not being respected or paid any attention. And then it's in this chaotic state. So you start with a bit of order. Okay, you can't extend your hip. Let's try to learn how to do that. You can't flex every part of your spine. You can't extend every part of the spine. Let's learn how to do that. You can't bend your knees past 90 degrees, because you just think about the shape of a chair, right? Okay, let's address that. Let's try to get you into full knee flexion, bring some order into the system. And then with time go, okay, now I think you're ready to bring a bit more chaos, but with a controlled dosage and with an intention. This chaos is, we're going to bathe you in chaos, as Ida Potta says. There's something he said, and I really love that line, bathe in chaos and see what effect it has, but we choose the bath. We're hoping that this chaotic situation, this open movement scenario, will not just cultivate complete freedom of movement with no constraints, because actually freedom comes from the application of constraints, right? Move however you like. It's like, dude, that's too difficult. Okay, move however you like, just with your right shoulder. Okay, I think I can do that. And actually something beautiful comes out, and there's some freedom there. So we do need to set some constraints around those chaotic situations too. It's normally the people who haven't done any serious practice themselves that fail to do that. That don't, you know, it's just how you feel, and it's everything is just follow your bliss, and it's you know, just go with it, man, and we'll see what happens. And it's like, that's a weak approach. Just as the completely linear, ordered, structured, you'll only do it the way I do it, that approach is limited too, because it's limited by the constraints of the teacher's abilities and what they've learned and experienced.
Yeah, that's, you know, it's ultimately the question, you know, do you practice it in situ, or do you kind of you practice the abstract form, like, do you go running or do you practice a squat, which is kind of just like an idea embodied, and yeah, it's so, I think it's challenging, and so much of the time in terms of the order and chaos thing, I think, and I see, my observation, and maybe a bit of my experience as well, is a lot of people come into this community because they have been injured or experienced some kind of physical limitation. So therefore they're like, I'm fed up with this. How do I get insanely unphysically limited? And then they do that, but in the process, they end up actually kind of fragilizing themselves because of avoiding chaotic situations. So therefore you get a movement teacher who you say, tap them on the shoulder and you go, woohoo, and you jump around and they trip over their foot and fall on the ground. You know what I mean? You're kind of like, what is that? And I think that I kind of noticed that, a lot. And I think that ultimately that should be the goal. You know what I mean? The prep is just prep. And if it's not prepping you anymore, then start doing the stuff. And that the stuff bit is, again, it's not as sexy from the outside because it's not, being an advanced fighting monkey practitioner isn't going to gain you millions of Instagram followers, but busting, one finger pull-ups will definitely do that, but your one finger pull-ups not going to make you a good climber or whatever,
Yeah, I remember a friend of mine, Nick Montula, he told a story of a yoga teacher he had, and they left the studio and they were going to walk for coffee or whatever it was, and she tripped and fell awkwardly, poorly, like when someone falls badly and everyone's a bit upset by it, and he was like, well, I'm not going to her anymore. It's because the practice does not translate beyond the mat.
Yes.
And I think it's so important to look at your teachers and see whether their practices are translating beyond the studio or beyond their specific domain. And also look at yourself and be honest with yourself and put yourself in situations where you're the beginner, complete beginner, and put yourself in novel situations, challenging situations, especially if you have developed some degree of competence in one specific area, and see how you perform. Okay, man, I can't perform in this area. My training's not working, right? You need the aliveness to test and retest and see what effect is this actually happening. And that needs to be the case physically, right? Like maybe I develop insane front splits, full front splits, full middle splits, but I can't sprint anymore because everything's loose and pulled apart. That's a problem. I realized this with myself. I'd done so much of the segmental joint work, pulling everything apart, that when I went and rolled jujitsu, grappling, I couldn't get everything to work together. I would just try to do things with one vertebra at a time. And it's like, sometimes that's useful, but other times you need the whole being to be involved. So I was like, all right, I need to start, one, practicing jujitsu, and two, I'll start deadlifting and bring everything back together again. So putting yourself in those situations as someone, physical situations, but then also, this is more important to me and overlooked, is what we spoke about a little bit already. Maybe I'm incredibly adaptable in the physical sense, but then we had a mix up because of daylight savings where we're talking an hour later than I thought we were going to be. That could have ruined my day if I wasn't adaptable. Well, I'll just shift things around. And actually, this is my tendency, is to be too structured. Go, no, but that wasn't part of the plan. What have you done? So I've had to try to take that seriously myself and go, well, who cares how physically adaptable I am if I'm not actually adaptable as a human being? It's got to be embedded, the physical practice. And again, we could talk about those layers, the concentric circles. It has to be embedded in this conception of what does it look like to be a good human being. And that's what Kit, you and I have spoke a little bit about Kit Lachlan, who's had an influence on me, and particularly early on. We've spoken with him recently, says, I want to do the things that make me a better human being. And I don't want to be an amazing mover and a shitty person and a bad friend and a bad brother and a bad son and, a bad partner. And it's very easy to specialize in one domain, which is what our culture wants from us. It's what our society wants from us. Hyper specialization, because that cultivates a certain type of productivity, right? That leads to productivity of the society as a whole. It's an economic incentive that pushes us in that direction, and also a knowledge incentive, right? Because if we all hyper specialize, then we can progress more in both the technological, in the sense of knowledge, in the sense of technology, and in the sense of building wealth. But what about what individuals want? And actually, I think we benefit the most from diversity. We need more to generalize as individuals and to have a little bit of competence in lots of areas. Otherwise, you slip a little bit out of your domain of competence and you know nothing. And it's absolutely chaotic. And that's not as resilient of a system. So I think that's also a useful thing to bear in mind. Something I try to reflect on is, again, it's the sacrifice concept. What am I sacrificing to pursue more in this specific domain? Which domains am I falling behind in? And where could I get the beginner gains? Where are the beginner gains waiting for me? And there'd be so many, maybe it's learning more about business. Maybe it's learning more about marketing and deciding, well, okay, I've thought a lot about advertising in a pernicious sense. Well, maybe I should think about making use of it in a positive way. It could be anything. I can't work with my hands. I know that's the case for me. I can't even hammer nails, man. Like, I'd be worried about it if that was my task for the day. So it's like, that's an area of absolute deficiency where I could become a fuller version of myself by investing just a little bit of time in it. So yeah, good thing to reflect on and pay attention to.
How do you think that where are the domains, or what kind of situations can we use to give us more of a perspective and kind of test what our training is for? Have you come across good ones and ones that kind of put us in broad kind of scenarios?
And if we're talking about just physical competence, then going into existing disciplines and not poo-pooing them because they're not working from the movement perspective is worth doing. Like, how do I match up against, what if you just go and play a sport? Maybe you haven't played sports for 10, 20, 30 years. Go and play a sport, and maybe all your training, built certain competence. This is the, the transferability issue, right? Maybe it didn't help you at all become more athletic. You thought you were super athletic, but not when there's a ball in your hands or a ball coming towards you. So I do think that's used. That's an easy way to do it, is look at, how do I perform as a generalist in a specialist's domain, right? All these guys are specialized. You go to the BJJ gym, and they're all specialized for BJJ, and they can't balance on their hands, but they don't need to. And their mobility is shot in certain ranges, but it's good enough in others. And you compete with them, and you see, like, where am I deficient? And where is my training? Is it working? Is it making me more competent generally? Or is it just making me more competent as a specialized generalist? Am I only competent in the domains where I've specifically trained? And there's no escaping that. Like, that's always going to be the case, is what you've done specifically you'll always have an advantage there, and it's not going to transfer perfectly, this generalization. It's a bit of a utopian ideal, but it should transfer to some degree. And I think it's important to think about that and observe it in the physical domain, but more importantly, like I just said, in other domains, and notice where it's not translating. Maybe you can interact really, really fantastically with a partner in a physical sense, but then you need to go and socialize at a party, and you're completely introverted and closed off and timid, and nothing wrong with introversion, but we should have the ability to socialize when we want to. So it's just finding areas, again, where you feel uncomfortable, and becoming more comfortable there, I think, makes you more resilient, more complete as an individual, and more useful to the people around you.
On this idea of transfer, there's obviously the concept of specific adaptation to impose demand. And when you're training for kind of advanced bodyweight strength skills, you meet this head on. You train things that you think might sit underneath it and might kind of transfer. Like, you might be doing, you might think a shoulder press might help your planche because your anterior delts are the things that help with your planche. And then you get back into your planche, you're like, it doesn't really help because it's such a complex thing. And really, the only thing I can do is try and smartly modulate my attention into into different scenarios that are as close to the plan as I possibly could. So maybe I put a band, or maybe I split it up into sets and reps. But ideally, you'd have perfect attention and awareness for as long as you could possibly have, and you just planche and you fall over, and you planche, you fall over, and you just spend like, 16 hours trying to planche until you've got it, and your body could like keep up and reproduce and make the demands. Can we really, how do you conceptualize that transfer thing? If we're only adapting to exactly what we do we have to train in the most diverse ways? And is there even transfer at all?
It's actually hard to answer. I think there is. And I think thinking about patterns rather than specific muscles or perhaps even joints is a good way to think about it. Focusing your attention on patterns. Can I push and pull in as many directions as possible? Okay, if I'm going to do my upper body strength work, right? It's pushing and pulling. They're the patterns. So can I push it and pull in different directions well or not? And it might take you going to a jiu-jitsu class to realize that you can't push when someone's with your right arm, when someone's on your left. You're weak in that position. And there's a pattern, there's a drill that you can use to strengthen that position, and another one that you can use to strengthen a position that's near it. But there are also scenarios that you can use, or games that you can introduce, that cultivate the ability to push and pull in every direction, that you could use instead, or as well as your more linear work. So I think last time we spoke a little bit about the non-linear work versus linear work. I think of it in this way: when you're taking something out of its context and you're deciding to isolate that piece and work on it, you realize you've got a deficiency in pushing right in front of you, for instance, or above you, like you said. Then you separate that piece out and you try to address it. You do linear work, and what you're looking for there is, what's the optimal alignment of my structure in this position to generate the maximal amount of force? And you're trying to find that position. And there is an answer to that question, right? And then you build strength there. But also you want to be capable of expressing, and more importantly, tolerating force out of that, a little bit out of that optimally aligned position. And that's where introducing a little bit of chaos to the training comes in. So that's on the physical front. That's kind of like, the answer is basically no. There is no perfectly generalizable, transferable approach in my mind. You're always going to get something new from a new field, or entering a new discipline, or focusing on a new quality. And that's actually a relief, because then that way it's continual. The growth is continuous. You can always develop in a new way, and there'll always be someone who knows more than you and who's more competent than you. And that's really good news for your development as a person, as a human being. And then intellectually, or not intellectually, but how you present yourself, I think this matters much more in terms of transferability. The advantage of doing a lot of different types of training, I think, is that you expose yourself to not being able to do lots of different things, and developing a degree of competence in those things. And that makes you more willing to put yourself into a situation where you're not yet competent, where you're a beginner, to humble yourself and to acknowledge that you don't know anything in that domain, and to start building up some amount of competence in that domain. So that's actually, I think, the meta skill, or the meta attribute that you develop is this recognition that there's basically infinite depth in every field, and one that makes you humble, because in the information age, we think that we can just Google it. How do you tile a bathroom? I'll just Google it. Now I know. I'll watch a YouTube clip. Now I know. And the tiler is like, dude, you don't know. This is what I do, And I noticed this when we're doing our fit out. Like, the tiler knows everything about tiling, absolute competence in that domain, but can't plaster. So that you're gonna get the plaster in, or maybe you could plaster a little bit, but you get the plaster in, and then he's got this insane depth of competence and knowledge and understanding in plastering, but can't paint, or can just paint a little bit. And you get the painter in, and there's all this depth in that field. And I think that's a really useful thing to know. That's a good thing to acknowledge. It's like, man, I'm so limited. And there are so many other amazing people and skills and uh, people and their abilities and depth in their fields. Maybe I can squeeze a little bit of juice from all of them and just steal a little bit from all of them. It's that Renaissance man idea, right? And just take a little bit and build myself up. So I have a bit of, I mean, at the end, it always comes back to connection, right? So now I can connect a little bit. I learn a little bit about plastering. So we have a bit more of a connection, and I respect your work. Wow, you've got so much competence there. And I learned a little bit about jiu-jitsu, and now I respect the depth of that field. Wow, there's so much depth everywhere. And it's the world opens up to you, and the depth of that world and your acknowledgement and respect for the people who are engaging in those different fields and practices and disciplines and so on is heightened as a consequence of that, which I think most of us, if we're honest and we're mounting a cultural or a social critique of our time, that's our biggest flaw. It's perhaps is not acknowledging the value of experience, not acknowledging the depth in different fields, and considering ourselves experts in every domain because we can Google it.
I did want to ask you about, on this topic of transferability as well. Someone like Yosef in Fighting Monkey, he'll say, should never isolate, and I'm sure that he'd be, and I think, Rafe kind of talks about like the self-organization that the body kind of gets when you expose it to chaotic situations. And I think, Yosef really, and his kind of perspective seems a lot more in line with that kind of idea. Do you think that you should never isolate and just modulate the intensity and the awareness bandwidth, appropriately? How do you stand on that?
Well, I've not worked with either of them directly, so I wouldn't know what those claims or ideas look like when borne out in their practices. And I would suspect that there's a degree of isolation, what someone would describe as isolation, in their practices anyway. Perhaps it's termed in different ways. And what I would say is, how much of the people that they're working with and how much are they themselves, like I said earlier, benefiting from previous isolations, previous moments of isolation. So if someone comes in and they've got flat feet, this happened recently at our studio. Physio tells me I've got flat feet. Everyone tells me I've got flat feet. I can't squat anymore because my feet are buggered. And they're very flat feet. So what are we going to do? Are we going to address that problem, or are we just going to put you into movement scenarios where it's helpful not to have flat feet? I mean, probably a combination of both is what's going to work. But, the harm that you're likely to cause along the way if you don't isolate to some extent and start repatterning, I mean, it just seems like you're really missing out on a very useful tool. It's this framing problem again. To understand something, we have to remove it from its context to some extent. And yes, the body is an organized whole, and it functions as a system. And the analogy of pull on any part of a t-shirt and it affects the entire fabric, right? It affects it most closely to where you pulled, but it affects the entire fabric. The body's the same, right? But so is everything, because we spoke about that already. The body's embedded in the world around it. And if we don't demarcate and we don't make any distinctions, then we just have to deal with the whole soup that we spoke about earlier. It's just a bunch of atoms swimming around, and I'm no different from you, and it's just a singularity, and it's all this one organism. It's like, okay, that might even be true. Cool. It's just an energy field. But there's a reason that science works as well. Science works as well. And drawing frames around things and going, well, we accept that the whole includes things outside of this frame, but I'm going to draw a frame around it and try to work just on this thing, can sometimes be useful and is useful. that's like, that's how we develop all of our tools and basically all of our knowledge. Not all of our knowledge, I shouldn't say that, but it's a very good method. It's a reliable method if you then reintegrate it. So that's the thing. And you can think about, I read this great book recently, The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist. It's on the hemispheric differences between the brain, in the brain, excuse me. And he says, basically your right hemisphere it says lots of things, but generalizing again, because we have to communicate is to generalize, right? We can't. And again, that framing thing, like actually we can't really communicate unless we generalize, unless we isolate.
That's what a dictionary is, right?
Yeah.
These are what all the word means and nothing else.
Yeah. But if you're like, no, but every cup is unique, then, I mean, you can say that, but I can still drink out of both of these things.
Yeah.
Whatever they are, there's two cups. They're completely different. They're unique beings, unique entities, but we call them both cups because we can drink out of both of them. So we do that no matter what. There's no avoiding that. There's no avoiding that isolation of things from their context, that separation, that teasing apart to create generalizations and abstractions. And in the book, in this book, and I think I've recommended it's a good read, it says the right hemisphere is specialized for seeing the whole, the entire picture. The left hemisphere is specialized for many other things, but I'm just drawing on one example, is specialized more for isolating out details. So you might say the right hemisphere is good at seeing the forest and the left hemisphere likes seeing trees, right? But then he says also the right hemisphere is able to integrate the learnings of the left hemisphere. So you look at the forest, right? Okay, the forest is in front of you. And then you zoom in and you look at a tree. And then you zoom in and you look at a branch. And you zoom in and you look at a leaf. And you use that zooming in and out that we talked about before with the mapping process. And then once you've done that and developed an understanding of the detail in each tree or in one of the trees, when you zoom back out and see the forest, it's different now. Yeah, it's different because you isolated a part of it, treated it as separate from its context, but actually that gave you more understanding of the entirety of the whole. And it's the same thing in the physical domain. I think you go, well, okay, there's a flat foot problem, and that's affecting your knees and your hips and your spine, and all of those things are affecting each other. But we're going to have to zoom in and isolate just the foot, or isolate just the knee, or isolate just the hip, and work on that a little bit. And then let's zoom back out and integrate that piece that we've just isolated and see what effect that has. Oh, it affects the whole. Yeah, of course it does. But we need to respect that, that process, do both of those things. And the two most common mistakes are we'll never isolate, because everything is just a unique whole and everything is connected. And that's a limited perspective in my view. And the other limitation is we'll only isolate and we'll only work on what your foot can do, or we'll only work on what your knee can do and what your hip can do without recognizing that there are downstream effects of that and upstream causes of how that thing is functioning. I think the most powerful perspective is the one that makes use of more tools, the one that does both and is willing to frame and then learn more about that thing and then unframe. And like a final point on that, this is actually how we develop competence, and this is how we learn new skills. Is say you expose me to, there are two ways of teaching someone, two primary ways of teaching someone a new skill. Just show them and allow them to try to learn through imitation. That would be one extreme. I'm not going to give you any details. I'm just going to show you what it looks like, and you're going to try to learn. The other extreme would be, I'm going to give you every single step along the way and you'll end up with the skill. Yeah. So that's details, left hemisphere, every single detail. You build them up one at a time until you learn the skill. And the other is right hemisphere. You see the whole and now you have to absorb it and learn it. But what your brain does when you see that whole and you're imitating it and you're trying to copy it is it usually will isolate pieces out. It says, okay, here's this pattern. It involves arms, legs, and spines. What are the legs doing? And you copy that and you integrate that. Or what is the spine doing? And you copy that and you get used to doing that and you automate that. Yeah. And what are the arms doing? You add that piece in and you actually go through this process of isolating, but you're doing it yourself rather than being told how to do that, what step, what process to take, what steps to follow by the teacher. So I think it's just a different experience along the way, but regardless, there's isolation happening. no matter what. It might be that you just see, well, that's the feeling of the movement, and I'll copy that, and then I'll add in pieces, add in details one at a time. So again, it comes back to that intuitive individual learning, which is fantastic. And the skill transmission, right? Like, you're going to do this the way that I say, you're going to do it correctly, and you're going to learn the technique that everyone else has used, and the process that everyone else has used, and you're going to develop the skill in that way. I think the most wholesome practice will involve both of those things. To avoid one extreme is to lean too heavily into your specific temperament. I think that's my perspective. Is you're tending to favor, I like structure, so we're going to use the structured approach. You like openness, you're more open, so we'll use the open approach. I think you should try to use both.
And I think a lot of people say, but I obviously question this as well, along with everything that I try and hear and take in. But people say that that the nonlinear learning approach, the just put the in situ and maybe like put some constraints around it and allow the self-organization to come through the body and the body to organize itself automatically. A lot of people say that that's the best way to learn. Like, that's learning how to learn. You can only get that if you actually put them in an open situation, allow them to do it itself. Do you think that that's entirely true? Or do you think that there's some kind of increase in your ability to learn future things through going through the left hemisphere kind of process where it's really structured?
I think it depends on what you're paying attention to, and it depends what skill you decide you want to cultivate as the individual. So if you follow a process that works lots of times in this kind of left hemisphere type of way, learning through the individual pieces, through the steps, then you will develop, if you pay attention to it, the skill of breaking something down into its individual components, and you will develop an understanding of what a good process looks like. What a detail-oriented learning process looks like. And then you can apply that to any new skill that you'd like to develop. So it definitely teaches you how to learn in one particular way. And the other way will teach you how to learn in another way, which is trying to absorb the whole and pick up the pieces yourself and do things intuitively and on your own without the assistance without the cheat sheet. It's definitely more common using the very structured process to become dependent on the teacher and wait for the next piece of information. That's definitely easier. It's a bit, and it can become, like we're waiting for the truth to be delivered by someone else. But I don't think it's necessary. It's just more likely. I don't think that's the guaranteed outcome. And it's also very possible that someone who's learning only through that put me in a situation, a scenario where I would learn, where learning is likely. I do think there's a lower ceiling on that person's development if that's the only type of training they're doing. And again, I just feel like anyone who's saying that that's all they do is actually not being honest, that there are pieces of the practice that are a bit more isolated and that aren't just in situ as you described it. They're not just intuitive learning. Like, there is a little bit of, here's a way to think about it. There's not a right or wrong way to move, but there is a right or wrong way to do certain movements. And you need both perspectives. I'm just going to deadlift however I like. I'm just going to lift heavy weights however I like. Okay, let's see what emerges from that. Like, there is an intuitive or innate intelligence in us for learning new things, but also the reason that we've developed and come so far as a species is that we use what we've learned from other people too. I don't have to relearn everything. Every generation, we don't have to relearn everything. We don't have to start from step one again. We can stand on the shoulders of giants, right? We can make use of what the people before us learnt and maybe save some time by following a more efficient process to learn some of the things that we just the boxes we need to tick. Some things you benefit from just ticking the boxes, and others you benefit from spending long periods of time in the practice. And I mean, I really just think you have to acknowledge the need for both of those things, for the order and the chaos, for the intuitive individual learning and for the structured delivery of known processes, known steps that have been proven to work. We want to be engaging with both of those things. I think that provides the most benefit.
And maybe that kind of links into, we might have a spectrum of, say, capacity to expression, improvisation, and adaptation, or maybe even awareness underneath that capacity. And, we want to try and build that up, as we go in terms of a movement practice. Are there different areas of the movement practice that you think either one of those two approaches are more useful for?
I think it is just situation dependent, isn't it? Like, strong for what? People talk about sport specific conditioning, right? Like maybe you're an amazing boxer and you've got fantastic conditioning for boxing, and then you go to a wrestling class and you're tanked in the first minute. The reason you're tanked it's not a cardiovascular deficit, because we know you've got a high VO2 max. It's a lack of efficiency. It's a lack of exposure to those specific movements, which means that you don't know when to relax. That's what not being efficient is. You don't know when or what to relax. You've got everything going all at once. And so you're tanked, you're exhausted after a little while. That's the way to think about sport-specific conditioning. It's an efficiency dimension, and efficiency is defined as not using more energy than you need to. And that's a relaxation. That's knowing how to relax. So it's always going to be specific to what you're developing. I think you can't get good at improvising without practicing improvising. Yeah. But also when you improvise and you go into something open, you'll get these little red flags. When I improvise and I'm halfway between standing and squatting, I don't have any control. I lose control in that moment. So I can't move freely through that range of motion. So that's a piece. That's a little red flag. I'll go and work on my half squat, control in half a squat. And that's something that you can do in isolation. You can take apart and do in isolation. And again, you could be the most amazing. You could know everything about a language, every single piece of vocabulary, all the grammatic rules. You could know everything about the language, but if you never go and try to speak it, you can't speak it. You can't converse with it. So I don't know that there's a better approach. I think there's the baptism by fire. Put yourself in it, see what comes out, see where you feel the restrictions. And then you go into the prep mode and you go, okay, these restrictions were holding me back. I need to address them using some specific tools. That's the way I like to think about it. Is there are parts that are about expression, parts of the practice that are about expression and being embodied and feeling what that feels like and engaging and opening and creating and improvising and fully being there. And then you go, well, where were the areas where I wasn't able to do that? What's holding me back? What are my restrictions? And then you go and you do the preparatory work and you address those restrictions to increase your physical potential, or at least bring it back to zero, right? Like if you've had a catastrophic knee injury we spoke about before as an example, let's just go into an open improv. There's a limit on what you're going to be able to do if you can't bear weight on that leg. So of course you rehabilitate, and some of that rehabilitate will be linear repetition, basic patterns. Like I'd love to see a very strong argument against making use of some amount of repetition of the same linear patterns. Haven't seen one so far. Yeah. But once you cultivate awareness, so this is actually a reasonable point to add. Once you really do cultivate awareness, then you can undertake that process yourself. You don't have to go, well, these are the drills that you use for rehabbing this thing, or these are the specific drills you use for addressing this specific restriction. Once you have a wide enough or a large enough toolkit, then you can draw the tools out yourself and pay close attention and feel. And maybe in that context, so to put like a little condition on what I said, the open situations can work because you've got the awareness to feel this is helping, this is not harming. But someone in the earlier stages of their development probably won't have that awareness. And so they'll need to use specific isolated tools a little more to address those restrictions.
Yeah. It kind of, in a lot of other domains, there seems, in a lot of other domains, there seems to be the necessity to go through a process of first isolation and then some kind of integration and then improvisation. It happens in music, right? You can't just pick up the guitar. You could just pick up the guitar and improvise and pay lots of attention and be like, whoa, I think there's a pattern on the fretboard here. But the amount of intelligence and mental energy that's needed to do that is crazy. Instead of being like, here's a pentatonic scale. And then when I play with this key, you can just play lots of those notes and it makes a nice noise. And now you can start to do licks and then you can solo, you know what I mean? And it's that same thing where it's like, I think that there's a romantic notion of like, oh, John Mayer, he's so, he just picked up a guitar and he was so good. And it's like, more times than not, those people are repetition nerds. And if you ask them, what was that that sensation, that feeling, that intangible that you did? He's like, oh, it's just when you're in this key and you're going to like pull on this, on this minor chord, you actually just raise it up to the 12th and it just gives you this twang that I've actually heard somewhere else and that I did, But it's so far beyond your comprehension and your current skill level that it seems like magic. And it's the same thing in terms of, like, we've talked about that magic kind of concept before,
Yeah, the teacher's role is to show you behind the curtain, show you what's in the hat and go, actually, it's not magic. And here's the process. Here's how you do it. But always the performance looks completely magical, right? And like, wow, does your training look like what it looks like when you're performing? It's like, no, of course they're not performing the repetitions. John Mayer gets on stage and just does scales. It's like, dude, show us what you got. So, I mean, I just can't see a way around making use of both of those things, making use of the left and right hemisphere, making use of order and chaos, making use of structured linear repetition, and making use of open improvisation, intuitive learning from bottom up, learning from top down. It's like the truth is always somewhere in the middle. I really think that's true. There's nuance in everything. And why not draw on all the tools possible and all the knowledge that people developed before you, right? Like, you're going to figure out how a guitar works, but that's been figured out. Why wouldn't you make use of that? And then get to a higher level, get beyond where the person before you got, right? Building on what they've learned, what they've developed. And again, I mean, I just think that's what's actually happening always anyway. We can talk about it in different ways, but you have to look at the practice and look at what it looks, how it actually looks, and not just look at what's the sexy stuff that showed up on Instagram or in that video that got me excited. What does it look like, again, behind the curtain? And I do think that you'll find both of those things in most practices. Anything where there's longevity in the practice. If there's no openness, then it becomes boring with time. People become disengaged and often do get injured. That's the Ronnie Coleman injuries. Too much linear work, too much repetition of the exact same thing. And then on the other extreme, if there's no isolated work, there's no separating things apart, there's also not longevity, which is why you don't really see 60-year-old breakdancers. You don't see 60-year-old bodybuilders very often. Maybe you do, but they're a bit broken if they're not doing other things, and they all get into yoga and whatnot later, right? And you don't see 60-year-old breakdancers because there's no prep. There's no prep in breakdancing. I mean, I'm sure there are people who are training with a good process there, but obviously I'm generalizing. It's perhaps too open of a discipline.
And it's kind of this constant tension between, do you teach someone how to fish in a much less efficient way to get fish, or do you just give them fish? And I think it always comes back to the fact that at the end of the day, fish is the goal. If for example, a lot of the time, fish is the goal. And a lot of the time,
sometimes fishing is the goal.
Exactly. Sometimes fishing is the goal. But sometimes we'll sacrifice, teaching someone how to fish when they really just need the fish, and they really just need that isolated work and to overcome the injury and, all of the negative things that we deal with. That's why coronavirus is a perfect example. It's like, holy shit, people have got viruses, isolate everything because we're dealing with a really negative situation. Like stoicism or some of the contemplative practices that we talked with before will isolate and box everything up to manage the chaos and the negative kind of feelings. And stoicism will be like, oh, well, you were lucky to have your parents in the first place, so don't be sad about their tragic death, but you don't want to say, oh yeah, but you'll be dead in a moment anyway, when you've just said, I love you to your partner. You know what I mean?
Right. Right.
And as you said,
I mean, you don't want to box things up forever, and you also don't want to never box them up.
Exactly.
We need both. We just need both.
And they're rules. They're not rules, they're tools, and you need to see them in the toolbox and in different scenarios.
That's what you're trying to give your students. I think that's what I'm trying to do, is give them tools for them to use. And it's definitely true that it's possible to give them the tools such that they rely on you. Like, the tools remain in my toolkit and you only get to use them when I say. And that's an ego base. That's about me, right? But if it's about their development, well, yeah, I'm going to share specific tools that have worked for me and that I've found useful, and help shine their awareness. And hey, maybe pay attention over here, pay attention over here. I think that's at least that's what I aim for. And that anyone that I've learned from, that I've learned something from, that's been what I would consider a good teacher, has done that. Give some tools, but then also give some freedom. Okay, you can play with this, and maybe you'll come up with something that I wouldn't have come up with, and then come back and tell me about that so I can give that to someone else. And maybe you learn in a way that's very different from how I learn, which is maybe it's a topic for another conversation. But maybe you learn visually by imitating someone, what they're doing, and you have to really follow along and do it together with the person. But I learn through verbal explanation. Give me description, tell me the steps, and I can learn that way, and I'll narrate them in my head as I practice. And all those different ways of learning are valid. It's good to be able to learn in all those ways, and not to lean only on the way that you prefer to learn. So that's another thing to take into consideration as a teacher. Is your form of learning the only way of learning, or is it even the best way of learning this particular thing? Or are you isolating yourself or limiting yourself to only the things that work and can be learnt in the way that you like to learn? And therefore, are you teaching only the things that can be taught in the way that you like to learn? And that's a limitation as well.
For sure, man. I think we should wrap up there. It's been a good long while, and such an awesome conversation. So thanks so much for coming on, man. I know people are going to gain heaps from that. So I just appreciate it so much. Love the chats.
Thanks, man. Yeah, I hope people found it interesting. I think after the first little while, I was mostly just talking with you. So
yeah,
I feel like I found it interesting, and hopefully you did. And maybe that'll resonate with other people as well.
Of course, man. Thanks so much.
Thanks for your time.